Is Mike Patton God? Interesting theory. So let's hijack a starship and travel to the center of the galaxy and find out. We're going to explore the director's cut by Fantomas in this week's Analytical Music Theory Analysis of the Week. By the way, this is a segment from the Carl King podcast, so if you enjoy this video, remember to like and subscribe and send us burritos. In this week's Analytical Music Theory Analysis of the Week, we will explore the creative arranging and mixing choices that Mike Patton made on the Fantomas record, The Director's Cut. That's where he took famous horror film scores and reinterpreted them in his own avant-garde 1980s hair metal style. And even though it's over 2 decades old at this point, it happens to be my favorite record Mike Patton has done on his own. We'll examine his works on 3 different tracks: Spider Baby, Twin Peaks Fire Walk with Me, and The Omen. Example number 1 is Spider Baby, based on music from the film Spider Baby, or The Maddest Story Ever Told, from 1967. And it was composed by Ronald Stein. This is an interpretation of the opening credits song, which had vocals performed by Lon Chaney Jr., who also starred in the film and performed vocals on it. Now, I want to point out that the original Spider Baby song has 2 renditions. The version in the film is muddy and seems to possibly be in mono and only lasts for just over 2 minutes. But there is a much clearer stereo version, which runs nearly 5 minutes, and I will put a link to both of those versions in the show notes so you can click on the hyperlinks and make them open up. Now, here are 8 things that Mike Patton did differently with Spider Baby. Number 1, the hard panning. In the opening, there is a piano riff, hard left, and percussion, hard right. The original was, I think, saxophone on the left and piano on the right. And there's some other hard panning happening here, including a left and right guitar, but also notice that those guitars don't have perfectly identical tones. And that is an effective way to create some dimensionality. Number 2, there are heavily compressed and overdriven drums. Dave Lombardo was credited on this album, but I would not be surprised if this track used a loop rather than Lombardo himself. Number 3, in the chorus, which is not exactly a chorus, there is a dissonant melody played by the brass, and Patton instead sings that melody with his mouth and teeth. And number 4, the chorus, at around 42 seconds, there's a portamento synth panned hard right, and he added hand claps on quarter notes. And the original had a similar sound to human hand claps, but it sounds more like a bunch of musicians banging their bows on the music stands and stomping their feet. And again, those hand claps on the Fantomas version sound like they're hard-panned left and right, but the tone between those channels doesn't entirely match. Number 5, at 56 seconds, to break things up, he added what sounds like what would normally be a 4-beat pause, but instead a 5-beat pause filled with some Mr. Bungle-esque sound design. And it's even got the Simpsons' grandpa, huh! Number 6, the original song only has 2 parts, an A and a B section. But on the Fantomas version, at 1 minute 28 seconds, there's a verse that drops down and acts as a bridge. And it sounds like it's got 2 drum sets or 2 drum loops. hard panned in stereo, and an out-of-phase effect happening. Listening to it through headphones that you would place on your ears, the effect is nauseating and will also make you want to throw up. And that slowly ramps back to a normal, in-phase sound through automation as they approach the chorus. So he created a bridge from what would have been just another verse. And that's some good thinking, Mike Patton. And number 7, the final time around the chorus, in the second half of it, the part that comes after the first half, the kit that is made out of individual drums changes quite a bit. And number 8, he decided to end this track with an ending rather than a fade out, which you would hear in the film's opening credits. And my main takeaway is this. Don't be afraid to use some hard panning. And don't be afraid to make people nauseated. And if you double an instrument in stereo, you can make each one slightly different in tone, rather than a perfect copy. Example number 2 is the theme from Twin Peaks, Fire Walk with Me, composed by Angelo Badalamenti in 1992. You might be familiar with the opening credits music from the Twin Peaks TV show, and this piece has some similar motifs, but it is not the same piece of music. And that's right, and the opposite of wrong. Fire Walk with Me had its own theme. And why they did that? We don't know yet, or maybe we do. Maybe it was a legal issue. But these things happen because music is a serious crime. Angelo Badalamenti's instrumentation was an intimate jazz ensemble, which is a muted trumpet, upright bass, keyboards, and a drummer using brushes. It's the sort of thing you'd hear using your ears in a quiet little jazz bar. So let's look at 6 things Mike Patton did differently with his interpretation of Twin Peaks' Fire Walk with Me. Number 1, in the intro, we have a bit of a heavier instrumentation with distorted hair metal guitars, although they are at a much lower dynamic level. And there's also echoing, robotic-sounding computerized synthesizer flourishes. Number 2, when the main melody begins, Mike Patton replaces that muted trumpet made of brass and instead sings it with some syllables that sound like what I do to do, which is obviously more that classic Mike Patton toilet humor that we all love. And also some finger snaps with a very fast echo effect on beat 4. Number 3, after 4 measures, we get blasts of hair metal instrumentation. And listening through headphones, I could be wrong, but I suspect that snare drum roll was overdubbed on top of the loud kick, drum, and cymbal crashes. And I think that's because the snare drum roll seems to be unbroken. And unless Dave Lombardo has 3 arms, which he might, I would expect larger gaps in that roll in order for his arm to reach the cymbals, which are mounted on cymbal stands. Number 4, the second time around in that very hair metal phrase at 1 minute 15 seconds, Mike Patton layers in some intense, high-pitched screams with lots of distortion, which I can't quite hear in the original. Number 5, after that, there's a section with a drum loop for 7 bars, followed by 1 bar with a chromatic descending synthesizer. And number 6, about halfway through this rendition, at 1 minute 51 seconds, Mike Patton adds what appears to be his own written lyrics. And if anyone knows the story behind that, let me know. It sounds like Dave Lombardo might be playing along with a drum loop during this very long section. The main takeaway, I think, is if you interpret an instrumental film score theme, just go ahead and add your own lyrics about box springs and spare change. Example number 3 is the Omen, Ave Satani, originally composed by Jerry Goldsmith, released in 1976. And the original had evil choir chanting coming out of a bunch of mouths. And there is a minor ninth from our good friend Music Theory. We hear strings and a chromatic riff and church organ. And that makes for a slow and ominous audio sound. Now, let's look at 5 things that Mike Patton did differently with his version of Jerry Goldsmith's The Omen. Number 1, in the intro, it sounds similar to the original. There's a small choir of Mike Pattons singing in Latin, along with high strings and a church organ. And it sounds like it could be a legitimate film score for a movie projected inside a movie theater where people would go to be watching it. And number 2, heavy guitars played through amplifiers come in, along with frantic, scrambly percussion that sounds like 100 pencils clattering away on hard surfaces. And there's also a harshly EQ'd vocal in monophonic or dual monophonic. Number 3, after the drum fill, Dave Lombardo launches into a cutting the steak punk beat with a heavily compressed and overdriven tone, and the vocals split into hard-panned left and right for contrast against the previous section. Number 4, at 1 minute and 3 seconds, the drum kit stops and is replaced by percussion that sounds like that frantic pencils clattering on a table and music stand, although now they are locked in time with the music. And Dave Lombardo adds some cymbal rolls, which is a rock and roll technique where he rolls the cymbals around. And number 5, at the end, it returns to what could pass as a legitimate film score with the choir of Mike Patton vocals and haunted church organ from a church that could be haunted. Now, I really only knew the Omen music from this Fantomas record, and I somehow never got around to seeing the original film or checking out the score. So I finally did, and I realized that there are some counterpoint melody details missing from this rendition, which were pretty significant in Jerry Goldsmith's version. Most importantly, Mike Patton left out that minor ninth that existed in the intro in Jerry Goldsmith's version. So, in my own totally subjective opinion, this track is the only one out of the 3 that didn't quite live up to the richness of the original. There's a lot left out, so it's more like, let's take this film score and make it into hair metal. But the Fantomas rendition definitely has its own fun energy to it. Perfect for cutting up cardboard boxes in the garage when those cardboard boxes pile up for too long in your garage. And I am contractually obligated to point out that horror film scores are perfect for metal renditions because those 2 genres start with the same building blocks: chromaticism, dissonance, and most importantly, riffs. So if you haven't already, I recommend checking out Fantomas, the director's cut, from your local public library, which is where you can get it from. Now, to answer the most important question of all time, is Mike Patton God? I can't remember. Okay, that's it for this week's Analytical Music Theory Analysis of the Week. If you enjoyed this video, support the creation of more by joining my Patreon for $1 or $5 a month. That's patreon.com/Carl King.